You're listening to the Zipping Into Research podcast at the University of Akron.
All right, so thanks everyone for joining us for our second episode of Zipping Into Research, and where we'll be talking with faculty in the College of Business and the wonderful research they're doing when they're not teaching classes. So I'm Dr. Federico De Gregorio. I'm professor in the marketing department, and
I'm Dr. Alexa Fox. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Marketing. And today we're very happy to have Dr. Brian Adams, an assistant professor in the Department of Economics, on our show. And we're going to be discussing his recently published research article, Location, Structure Type, Rent Divergence Within Neighborhoods, which was published in the Journal of Housing Economics and co-authored with Dr. Randall Verberge, a senior research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. So, Brian, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, could you start by telling us a little bit about what you research overall and what motivates you to investigate these areas?
Yeah, I'm interested in where things happen and why, where people make stuff, where people buy stuff, how prices change across space. And that led into when I was working at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, measuring housing prices and measuring housing prices in different areas so that the consumer price index could have a representative sample of housing costs.
That's a really important topic that everybody can relate to, right? And I think that that's what's really neat about your research is that it has implications for really every consumer.
Oh, housing's huge. It's a huge part of nearly everyone's budget.
all right, okay. So let us dive into the article itself, the work you did for that particular piece. So overall, right, for our audience, can you set up the motivation of the research and then also basically what you found?
Yeah. So our findings were that apartments and houses and rental houses have different inflation rates. Rent for houses and rent for apartments moves differently. Now, for a long time, people were treating that as not the case. They were assuming that apartments or rental houses, they were all having prices that moved with overall rent inflation. And you could use one as a representative of the other. Previous research had looked and said, well, location's really important. Location being the famous real estate aphorism. And it is. That's what previous research had found. It's by far the most important determinant, not only of rent levels if for similar sized housing units, but also for rates of rent change. But it's not the only thing. And so that's what we were looking at. Once you control for location, is it still the case that apartments and houses have different rent change patterns? And it was. Even within the same neighborhoods, you could have, and the 2010s did have apartment rents going up in some years by half percentage more than housing rents, even once location had been controlled for. So it wasn't just downtown rents are increasing more than suburban rents. It was the structure type itself having some explanatory power.
So diving a little bit deeper into that, the notion of the aphorism, as you call it, right? That location that everybody seems to kind of know about. So your finding seems to, part of your findings goes says, as you were mentioning before, that it's not solely the location, right? There's other factors that factor into it, including the type of dwelling it is, the type of place it is, an apartment, a house, freestanding house, whatever. Maybe it's the features in the place, right? People are choosing based not just on where it is. So could you talk more about that and how that either builds on previous work or contradicts it or add nuance to it? Yes, situate that for the people listening.
Yeah, the previous work had treated previous work had treated houses and apartments as fairly interchangeable. That location was by far the most important determinant of rent change. And that all these other features affected the rent levels, but not rent change. What that misses is that even controlling for location, these other things add up to a non-negligible amount. So if you ignore that, then you can then sample representativity becomes really important for measuring precise rent change. And for the CPI in particular, that meant that they needed to rethink how they were doing their housing sample because they had a mismeasurement problem.
Okay.
I want to follow up again on something you mentioned about like in the 2010s, you'd said there were some different kind of trends happening. And I think in the paper it was termed apartment dominance. And then in the pandemic, there was different trends that were being seen like in the 2020s. So could you kind of distinguish, because that was such a unique blip in time that, everybody saw so many different ways that their world changed. Can you talk a little bit about that apartment dominance versus detached dominance that occurred later, like in the pandemic years?
Yeah, so the relative prices of apartments and houses can persist for a decade or so, but there's no fundamental force that says that apartments will always get relatively more expensive. And the pandemic was a time that flipped that. Um, and because, well, because potentially for a lot of reasons, having your own HVAC system suddenly became maybe a lot more appealing.
Right.
But even things of long-term supply, right? By the late 2010s, there were a lot more apartments starting to come online, having been recently built. So that could also be part of it.
Makes sense.
So, okay, at the risk of asking a really dumb question, in your field, right? So you're in this paper, you study rents, right? The level of rent. For people who are not economists, they don't really, follow economy much. Why is this a common thing that economists study, the rent level, right? Someone could say, well, why didn't you study home prices of sales of homes or mortgages? Why? So what does understanding rents of buildings tell people in general, right? Beyond economy, but what would it imply for someone who's just, freshly tuning in and trying to understand what it means for them?
Yeah. So for a homeowner, knowing like the rent of your city and that inflation rate, maybe not the most relevant. It's highly relevant for our overall inflation measures for like the CPI, because they're even the implied value of that homeowners get from owning their own home, from getting free rent from the house that they own. Um, that's a component of the CPI, and it's measured off of actual rents from their housing sample. And so that's where this big mismatch between owner-occupied housing is mostly detached units, rental housing is mostly apartments. And so if you're measuring the one based on a sample for the other, and they'd been very careful about location controls, but because of the structure tightness alignment, there was mismeasurement.
Right.
So why would you care about it? If you care about the CPI, you should care about this mismeasurement. And why should you care about the CPI? Because like a lot of things are indexed to it. Social Security is indexed to it. 1/10 of a percentage point difference in a CPI measure is hundreds of millions of dollars in Social Security COLI adjustment.
Right. So a big important aspect of this is getting the accuracy of that CPI, and the rent is obviously an aspect, as you said, of calculating that CPI and getting it as close to as accurate as possible.
Yeah, so a average rent difference of 0.5 percentage points between apartments and houses. That's maybe not something that a homeowner is going to be emotionally invested in, but that means like 0.1 of a percentage point bias in the CPI. And that means like $800 million a year in Social Security adjustment.
Okay.
Well, what are some of the next steps for your research or the work in your field, whether it's a part of the work you're doing here or maybe other projects that you're working on?
Yeah, so next up in kind of the housing, next up in the housing segment of my research, is looking at the inter-area price differences and the precision measurement of those. Things like comparing cost of living between places is really highly dependent on getting the relative prices of housing correct. And housing's different in different markets. The quality of housing and hard to measure characteristics is quite a bit different. How well maintained housing is in different markets varies and correlated with how expensive it is. So because these haven't been handled well by measures that everyone from HUD to news to the news uses, we've got potentially an overestimate of housing price differences and an overestimate of cost of living differences in the US.
Interesting. So when when people are maybe moving for work or they're moving around in the US, right? Your average person will maybe look up some index about, okay, what is the cost of living in New York City or in North Dakota or wherever it is that they might go. Depending on what source they use to look at the cost of living and try to figure out, am I making more money actually or less, depending on housing and all these other things. Depending on what source they use, it could be very different. They could be theoretically getting a very different picture of what is the cost of living in that same place.
Right, because the houses that these indexes are assuming are comparable really aren't.
Okay.
Yeah, very interesting.
Okay, so we are now moving on a little bit to the section that we are calling wrapped. Researchers are people too. They don't just sit there and calculate things and then go to class and teach things, right? They are regular old people that do regular old stuff. So we will maybe ask you a bit more, just more personal, couple of personal little things so our audience knows a bit about you. Alexa, you want to start off?
Can you tell us a little bit about your favorite foods or dishes to eat and why?
I think pasta is my favorite food. Actually, no. I've perfected a salad. I have red leaf lettuce, cucumber, edamame. It's a great base for a salad.
That sounds great. It might go well with the pasta, right? They could go well together.
Complementary, yes. Not as a replacement. Be
No.
careful. There's no replace it. But all right. So I have a more bigger questions. In a perfect world or a perfect alternate universe, if you were not an economics professor or an economist working in industry, what would you be doing?
Be a cartographer. I'd make maps.
Ooh. Any particular kind of maps? What kind of maps would you make?
Oh, maybe forestry maps showing like where different types of trees are.
Oh, wow.
I guess that's a pretty specific answer.
Yes, it is. Now I'm more why? Why would you? Yes.
Oh,
You love trees?
like I do. I love trees. I love ecology. I love maps. I love maps that about ecology.
Akron's a great place to be then because we have so many beautiful parks and areas to explore. You must enjoy that a lot.
Oh yeah, the Maple Beach ravines. Yeah, it's beautiful here.
All right. Well, we are done. So thank you very much, Brian, for spending some time with us, telling us about your research and your work overall and a little bit about yourself. And that's it. And thank you to everyone who joined in and talked to us, listened to us. Yeah, you didn't talk to us. We didn't let you talk to us. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks.
Mhm.